Thank you, firstly, for having me today. It's really nice to be a part of such an esteemed group of people on the panel today. I think Andrew and I was talking this morning, and we walked about 100 metres down the road to be here today. But Barbara and Wolfgang travelled about 30 plus hours, so I think that's fantastic on their part. So what I've been asked to talk about today is emerging markets for Australia and Australian tourism particularly. So where are we at the moment? What are emerging markets? What does it actually mean to us as a marketing agency, and how can we best attract those consumers from those markets? So I think we're talking about emerging here, and when we look at some of these markets like the likes of China, we're not necessarily meaning that they're emerging in the way that they're building their economy, but more so it's the emerging potential that they have for our tourism industry. So I think there's three sort of key parts that I wanted to discuss today. So what are those emerging markets? Where are they in the next 5 years? But more importantly as well, where are they in the next 10, 15 years? It's important to look forward for. The impacts on Australia. So not just looking at the positive impacts of emerging markets, but also what are the negative impacts? What are the best ways that we can approach these markets, and what can the industry do collectively to get the most out of it? And then lastly is really about what the industry does and how can we learn about these people to leverage from, potential opportunities, I guess, worldwide. So looking first at how Tourism Australia actually targets a lot of the markets that we're active in at the moment. And the first one is understanding the actual spend or the impact on the Australian tourism industry and the economy in terms of how much they actually spend whilst they're here in Australia. So looking at the 2015 numbers, which is in the blue, that's essentially how much money they spent in Australia for that year. So you can see the out and out front runner there is China with 7.7 billion spent in 2015. I'm missing a couple of actual ones in there. USA is actually third. The actual formatting's gone off a bit there, but essentially what we're trying to show here that there's potential in each of the markets that we're active in. So Tourism Australia is actively marketing in all of these particular areas, but today what I want to take you through is just three markets, three what we see as the next big markets for Australian tourism, but not just in the next 5 years, but the next 10 to 15. So the first one is again China. So you can see it's almost doubling the expenditure in the next 5 years. So it's going to be a really big one for us. And then India and Indonesia there as well, which are also doubling in their size. Moving straight on to China, and as I was mentioning before, and I think it's mentioned by Wolfgang, that this is a mature market, it is an established market, but for Australia there is that emerging potential. So at the moment, where there has been 130% growth in Australian arrivals in the past 5 years, and in the past year, we, as we've heard, there's been about 1 million visitors to Australia alone, spending around 7.7 billion. So some big numbers there straight away. Forecast out to 2020, so another 5 years away, 4.5 years away. Expenditure in Australia is estimated over $13 billion to the economy. So straight away, that's a big number. And there is also, generally speaking, outbound travellers. There's about 200 million they're expecting around that 2020 mark. As an example of how this market's grown, we've heard a lot of numbers around China, and just to add a few more to the book, in 1999 there was under 10 million travellers out of China. This figure actually rose to around 125 million last year. The important thing to remember is, and what Andrew was suggesting there, was that 58 million of that 125 were actually travelling to Hong Kong or Macau, and only 0.7% actually coming down to Oceania. Which includes obviously Australia there. So in terms of Australia's share of this market, it is certainly not established. It is certainly an emerging potential market for us. One interesting stat that I found when I was doing a bit of research for this work was that only 6% of the Chinese currently have passports to travel. So that's also a barrier for international travellers, not just for destinations like Australia, but globally. So the opportunity for Australia is actually around the latent demand potential that sits behind travellers wanting to visit Australia as a destination. So what we've done here, we conduct consumer research in China and a number of other markets on a yearly basis, and we've spoken in the last few years, we've spoken to about 5,000 long-haul consumers from China. And we ask them basically where they sit in the purchase funnel. So how aspirational is destinations around the world? And we give them a complete list of 100 plus nations, and we ask them to rate which ones they're most aspirational. So basically, where, if money and time and cost were an issue, where would you want to go? And that's the aspiration number. Thankfully for that one, we're actually number one, which is no new news. But it's important to know that we are, as Australia as a destination, the most aspirational destination. In terms of awareness, that's awareness of what we actually have on offer. So what are the products and experiences that Australia has to offer? And the Chinese rate us number one for that as well. So the awareness is there. The intention, these are people who are saying that they're intending to visit Australia in the next 24 months. So again, Australia is the number one market for Chinese consumers. The biggest issue here is visitation. So we actually dropped from number one intention down to number 10 for visitation. So we're losing a lot of share to other markets. So what we do is we look at the strongest competition, and generally it's the powerhouses of Europe that are coming through, but also the stalwart, I guess, of USA is also extremely a strong competitor there as well. The important thing though is they love our offering. So when we actually go to these consumers and we say to them, here's a couple of experiences and destinations that Australia has on offer, all through consumer research, we found that 58% of consumers who actually hadn't visited Australia before now intend on visiting Australia post seeing that information. So there is what we're referring to as latent demand potential. And if we can leverage from that, we're going to see more and more consumers coming in from China. In the bottom right-hand corner there, it's around the preferred experiences that we have on offer. So there's no real surprises there. They love our aquatic and coastal environments. They love our wildlife. Wildlife is big key for this market. The nature side of things is extremely important. Most recently, there is this upweighting of food and wine in travel. It's something that we've been focusing on at Tourism Australia for this market particularly. And then last, which is something that we've seen over the years, is shopping is also important to this market. So that's probably enough about China. So we'll move straight on to India. So India, from our perspective, is really the China of tomorrow, and it's not really a market that we're going to see much growth in the next 5 years as much as some of the other stronger markets. It's one of these markets that we need to start preparing for, and by preparing for it now in that sort of 10 to 15 year section, we'll really be leveraging from it. So it's the emerging possibilities of this market is what we really need to attract. We've seen 74% growth in arrivals in the past 5 years. Last year alone, Indian consumers spent over $1 billion in Australia. So this is actually being forecast out to about 1.9 by 2020. So again, a really important market for our industry as a whole. There is about 12 million outbound travellers who are planning on travelling long haul up until 2020. So there is certainly an opportunity there again. Like the Chinese, we're the most aspirational destination for Indian consumers. There is this growing middle class, and as they become more affluent, we're certainly at the top there to leverage from. Awareness, we're number 2, behind Switzerland, and intention, we're number 1. So again, a similar story. We're dropping again in the visitation area, so that's a conversion issue that we need to address. Strongest competition is actually from Switzerland. They're the out and out biggest brand for the Indian market, generally due to their Bollywood movies being filmed there. And then obviously the USA has a really big VFR market from the Indian market. In terms of latent demand, 54% of people actually now intend on visiting Australia, having seen information that we shared with them. So again, there's that potential there that we can really showcase. And similar to the Chinese, they like all of our experiences on offer. The last one there, the boomerang, that's actually representing history and culture, or heritage, and that's one of the ones that we're actually losing out to Europe particularly on. So the other ones there, we're certainly up the top, but the history and culture thing is where we're really losing out, and that's something that we need to address. The last market I want to discuss was Indonesia, and this is like without using it too much, it's almost an emerging market of the next 20 years. So it actually hasn't hit its straps yet. It's certainly, we've seen growth in the past 5 years of around 26%, with expenditure in the last 12 months at around 600 million. So it's still beneficial to us. It's still one of those things that we need to ensure that we've got a presence there, a marketing presence. But it's certainly not necessarily a market for the next 5 years, but maybe one for the next 15. This one is a bit different. We've done a fair bit of work in this market because it's close proximity, and in terms of the actual population, the travelling population, there's expected to be about 13 million by 2020, and we're actually slightly behind when it comes to aspiration and intention to visit. So we're sort of holding our own through the purchase funnel there. So we want to understand a little bit more why we are not the most aspirational destination, and how can we actually improve our position there and really leverage from this potential market down the future. One of the things that is really strong here is Australia is actually perceived to be really lacking truly unique hero experiences for this market. So they're really looking at the likes of Europe and America for its pop culture, which really stand out. We are the closest destination for them to Western culture, though there seems to be with this particular market some cultural sensitivities that we must overcome in the coming years. In terms of their latent demand, it's slightly lower, but it's still saying that out of the people who were non-intenders of visiting Australia, there's still 30% of people who are liking what we have on offer, and who will certainly be interested in coming in the next few years. Now, a couple of interesting things about Indonesia's population. It's actually the 4th largest in the world. It's actually roughly 3 times that of Vietnam or Thailand. It's 8 times that of Malaysia and 50 times that of Singapore. So whilst we're active in those other markets, this actual market for us is huge, and if we can unlock that potential, we'll certainly be in a good place. It's one of the fastest growing Asian outbound travel markets in terms of volume and value. And it's estimated to reach 10.6 million trips per year in 2020. So what are the impacts on Australia? So the first things are we want them to experience our product. So we get them down here, just like Barbara, we want people to disperse, and we want them to see what we have on offer here, because that's the first step of any tourism experience. From that experience, they obviously are going to spend money, which is going to be beneficial to the products, the experiences, the tourism industry, and then obviously the economy more broadly. And then they go back and they'll share that. They'll become our advocates of the destination, and they will do the work for us there. And it's like all the research that we have, the actual the advocacy around sharing their trip experience is more powerful than any bought media that you can buy. So it's a really important thing that we get them here. We get them to experience it so they can pass on their experience to their friends and family. However, there is negative impacts, or maybe not negative impacts, but more challenges that we must face with each of these particular markets. The first is greater competition. So a lot of the actual emerging markets are emerging for a reason, and there is a lot of competition out there vying for these consumers' dollar. So we need to make sure that we stay on top of the ball, we are proactive in the way that we approach these, and we start looking at some of these markets that might not have any potential next year or in the next 3 or 4 years, but might be the next big thing in 15 years, so we're ready when they actually start travelling. And then the other part is demand outweighing supply. So it's something in a lot of our capital cities around hotel rooms. It's a challenge that is really around investment, and the more people who come here, the more hotel rooms, the more products, more experiences that we require. So at the moment, it's not the greatest issue, but there's certainly that challenge of demand outweighing supply, something that we should always consider looking at. So what does the industry really need to do to attract these consumers from these new markets? So the first thing is quite common sense, and that's tailoring to customers' needs. So really looking at not only the infrastructure, but also the service. And this might be things like signage, maps, menus, language speakers, or even cultural sensitivities. So when they come here, they feel welcome. and they feel like they want to return, they want to go back and they want to share their experience. Nothing's going to affect our industry more if they come here and we don't deliver on their expectations, because their word of mouth and the power that they have when they go back to their destinations, to their markets, and spread the word could be detrimental to Australia if we're not up with the latest customer needs. The second thing is it's really around sharing the customer's experience. So it's not just about them sharing their experience via their social networks, but it's important for us as an industry to share what they're doing. Tell the world how we're attracting consumers. Tell the world what our consumers are doing, and leverage, I guess, off the tourism network. The state tourism organisations and Tourism Australia and a number of other bodies have social media accounts that reach millions of consumers every year. So leverage off those. Doesn't mean you have to have a social media account attracting thousands or millions yourself. There's certainly tools out there to get the greatest exposure. And the last part is really around selling the destination, and I know this has been touched on today, but it's really about it's not just about the product. Gone are the days where consumers don't actually travel for free Wi-Fi or 24-hour gyms. They're actually travelling for the experience or the location. So really make sure that you look a bit bigger picture, and you ensure that you're selling what we have on offer as a destination and not necessarily the sole product, and we can all benefit. The important thing here is really but knowing your customer, and if you don't know your customer, you can't do any of these things. So there is sources out there to really learn about who your customer is and the best ways to target them. And so I encourage you to do your research, as we've discussed, and really understand why one consumer wants to choose Australia over another destination. And lastly, I think it's important to share success, and it might seem a little bit odd, but advocacy is really powerful, and so leverage from your competition. So working with competitors might not sound like the most appealing thing to any business or any tourism bureau, but essentially if you work together in the industry, we're all going to benefit bigger picture, because essentially the common goal is to get more tourists to Australia, and hence they spend more. And so if we do that, Australia as a destination and your product will benefit. Tourism Australia itself works closely with our state tourism partners and also our regional tourism partners, so we've all got a one voice approach to how we're attracting consumers. The final message is work together in the industry and we'll all see the benefits. That's all I have time for. I'm happy to field any questions now or afterwards. So thank you very much.